Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We know participants are just signing on, so we'll get started in just a moment. Thank you so much for being with us today. Okay, wonderful. Thanks for your patience, everyone. It's Melissa McVie here from the OARC team. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your afternoon to join us for our special webinar today. We have enlisted the help of a special guest speaker to help us explore the topic of mental health and wellness for people living in long-term care. Before I introduce our guest, who you'll see on camera, I wanted to review a few housekeeping announcements. You'll notice that all participants are in listen-only mode. We've muted your audio in an effort to eliminate background noises and distractions for our speaker. This session is being recorded for educational purposes, and it will be available on our website following today's session. We have protected time for an interactive question and answer period at the end of today's webinar, at which time we'll invite you to type your questions into the chat box. This webinar is for information purposes only and not a replacement for seeking individualized mental health support. We encourage you to seek supports available to you in your home, in addition to using the resources shared with you today. Without further delay, I'd like to give a warm welcome to our guest, Jill Dennison. Jill Dennison is a mental health promotion and resilience facilitator with the Canadian Mental Health Association based out of Hamilton. A graduate of Wilfrid Laurier University, Jill provides education to the community as a mental health first aid instructor and an assist instructor, a safe talk instructor, and a facilitator of the Mental Health Works program. Jill is also the coordinator of the TAMI Talking About Mental Illness program. Jill is a wife and a mother of 3 adult children and 2 fur babies. Over to you, Jill. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. And the reason I always include my dogs in my bio is because they're likely to join us at some point. They really like Zoom. And over these last 2 years, they've become very familiar with it. So if they do join, I apologize. Right now they're sleeping, so let's hope they stay that way. So thank you so much for having me, especially this week. It's Mental Health Week. We are so excited. As one of my colleagues said, it's kind of like our Super Bowl, but it's a week long. So Mental Health Week has been going on for a number of years through the Canadian Mental Health Association. And it's our opportunity to kind of highlight mental health, talk about it, share resources, and also talk about a theme. So this year's theme is empathy. And I think that's really a great theme considering what we've been through in the last 2 years. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you about understanding mental health in older adults in our communities, in our long-term care homes. And I absolutely love questions. So please feel free. If you're worried you might forget it, pop it into the chat anytime and we'll take a look at it at the end. But I do appreciate that. So just to give you an idea and what we're going to be talking about, we're going to get started here. So as you've noticed, I'm asking you what zone you're in today. So if you have a second and you don't mind popping into the chat, let me know if you're in the green zone, the yellow zone, the red zone, or the blue zone. Or maybe you're kind of green and blue, or maybe you're kind of green and yellow, or maybe you're yellow and red. So one of the things that I think is really important, and the reason I ask this question all the time, is understanding kind of where you're at. Any given moment is a really super important thing to do. Thank you. And I really appreciate the fact that you guys are sending this in. You're very honest. I appreciate that. One of the things the pandemic has taught us is that it's okay to feel more than one thing at a time. Often we think we just have to be either in the green zone or the yellow zone. But what we might feel is a little bit of both. Maybe we're feeling, pretty regulated right now, but this morning we weren't. And maybe we were overwhelmed or anxious or really down. So it's okay to know that we can move all over the place and that it doesn't have to necessarily stay in one zone. But it's important to recognize what these zones look like for you too. Because I know for me, when I'm in that yellow zone, feeling overwhelmed is the big thing for me. It's like, whew, I got a lot going on. How do I kind of regulate myself? So recognizing this in yourself and what it looks like. So thank you everybody for joining us today and for being so open and honest with us. We really appreciate that. Okay. So whenever I do a presentation, one of the biggest things that I do is outline what actual mental health is. Okay. And I think this is something that actually people struggle with. We know what physical health is. We've been learning about physical health since we were knee-high to a grasshopper. Since we started school, we've learned about our physical health. We had gym class. We took health classes, nutritional breaks, recess. All of this focused on our physical health. And there's nothing wrong with that. We definitely should be learning about our mental health. But as we like to say, if you have a body, you have physical health. If you have a brain, you have mental health. Guess what? We're human beings. We have both. And we always will. And we always have. We are born with mental health. We will die with mental health. It's important that we understand that. It's important that we understand that it's a part of who we are and that our actual physical health and our mental health are intertwined. But our mental health doesn't stay static. You don't wake up in the morning and just stay here all day long. You guys indicated that in the chat with me, that maybe some of you started off green but went to yellow. Maybe you started off yellow and now you're more red. That's our mental health. It's your ups, it's your downs, it's your backwards, it's your sideways. It's those days where you wake up feeling fantastic. It's those days where you wake up feeling awful. It's those days where you wake up just kind of feeling meh, somewhere in between. Mental health is the capacity of each and all of us to feel, think, and act in ways that enhance our ability to enjoy life and deal with the challenges we face. It's a positive sense of emotional and spiritual well-being that respects the importance of equity, social justice, interconnections, personal dignity. This is a good definition. It's from the Public Health Agency of Canada. Why is it a good definition? Because it recognizes that everybody's mental health is different, and it's going to be different. Our mental health changes every day. It also changes significantly over time. It's important to recognize that who our supports are, our life experiences, things that have happened to us, people that have come and go, all change and have an effect on our mental health. It's interesting to me that we don't have a blanket way of dealing with our physical health, right? We all deal with our physical health differently because we have different things going on. But we often look for a blanket way to look after our mental health, and we can't. It's completely individual. And the sooner we recognize that, the better we are. And you probably heard that term, positive mental health or positive mental well-being. What is that? Well, it's about having a balance in life. But it's really hard some days to be in balance. And the other thing that can be very tricky is, how do you stay in balance when the world underneath you and the floor underneath you is constantly shifting? That's what we've experienced for the last 2 years, a constantly shifting floor. So staying in balance is hard, it's difficult, but it can be done. And some days we're way better at it than others. And when we talk about the importance of understanding mental health, the reason we want to identify that everybody has it is because we need to normalize having these conversations. And if you were like me, when I was in school, we didn't talk about it. I grew up on a farm. The last thing we were going to mention was somebody's mental health. There were no days off. There were no mental health days. It was strictly pushed through. And I'm not saying that that was a bad thing. I learned a lot kind of growing up that way, but I've also learned how important my mental health is to my physical health, and they go hand in hand. Green is the color of Mental Health Week. You'll see it around a lot this time of year, which is great. It means hope. It means recovery, but it didn't always mean that. Green was actually worn like the scarlet letter, that if you were diagnosed with a mental illness, you were told to wear green so people could identify you and stay away from you. Mental illness is something different than mental health. It's an illness. It's an illness that occurs in the brain. And the stat that we use is 1 in 4 people in a year will develop a mental illness. Very close, probably closer to 1 in 3. About 50% of people will have a mental illness within their lifetime. Those are significant numbers. And we get the question all the time, do we think it's increasing? Do we think there's more of it out there? Mental illness has always existed. It's not something that's new. What we are doing a much better job of, though, is recognizing it, talking about it, becoming more familiar with it and how to manage it and deal with it. Instead of hearing things that were kind of off in the distance before. It was never really a subject that was okay to talk about. And that's what I do. I try and make it okay to talk about this in our homes, in our workplaces, in our communities, as we need to. So mental illness is a chemical imbalance in the brain for the most part. And it's not a choice. It's not a behavior. If somebody doesn't wake up in the morning and go, ooh, I think I'll have depression today. That sounds fun. I've never tried that before. No, it's an illness just like any other. And people learn how to live with it, how to manage it. All of those different things. And there's lots of different ways we can do that. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But I also want to look at the subject of if my computer, right, mental health and older adults and what the difference is. It's really interesting because when we talk about that balance in life, we know that the challenge is to stay in balance, but it's a learning process. So it doesn't mean that just because you didn't learn this when you were younger like me, that you can't. We absolutely can. And we can be constantly learning, okay? And that's what I think is a really important thing. Whether we are an older adult ourselves, whether we live with one, support one, work with individuals who are older adults, we need to know that learning doesn't stop. Neither does our mental health. So we can continue to learn about it no matter what age. So there's a couple things I want to focus on right off the top. Anxiety in older adults. So this is really interesting because history tells us and our books tell us that anxiety used to be thought that it decreased with age, that the older you got, the less anxiety you had. I find that interesting. And I want you to keep that thought in your head. But what we know is anxiety is one of the most common types of mental illnesses around. And that stat doesn't change when you get older. It's exactly the same as if you were 15, or those stats stay the same. Anxiety is a common type of mental illness, and it can happen in older adults, just like it can happen in younger adults and in children. So it doesn't decrease with age. But what's also interesting is that they used to believe that while anxiety decreased with age, guess what increased? Depression. That depression was a natural part of aging. It's not. It's not. Just because we grow older doesn't mean we have to develop depression. Depression can happen, and sometimes we do see an increase when people move into long-term care homes, but it's not always clinical depression. It could be environmental depression, which can disappear over time. And we know that actually 80% of people, older adults, respond really well to treatment. The sad part is 90% don't seek help. And why do you think that is? One word, stigma. There's a stigma that surrounds mental illness, that it's not something we should talk about, that it's a private matter, and it doesn't happen to only certain types of people. So if we were brought up in an age where we didn't talk about it, where it wasn't safe to do so, it makes it really difficult to seek help for something that you're not allowed to talk about. And if we have we know that people respond well when they get support, we need to start talking about it, no matter what the age, no matter what the time we're experiencing this. As we move kind of into our older adulthood, there's some different challenges that maybe don't play out in our younger years. There's always going to be family stress and things like that, and finances, absolutely. But there's often social isolation that comes with, especially going into a long-term care home. That can change, and it can be it's a significant life change for people. I want people to understand that. This is significant. It's just like moving, getting married, getting divorced. Those are significant life situations. So is moving into a long-term care home. So is moving anywhere. Your life changes, and these can add extra challenges. We also know that with this pandemic, that increased. Holy, did it increase? Isolation increased. Lack of connection increased. Delayed treatment increased. And this one, I think, was really hard to understand and we know that nurses and doctors definitely were burnt out, but it's really difficult when a catastrophic event like a pandemic happens, and it makes it difficult to access treatment that could definitely not only extend people's lives, but improve their quality of life. We also know that sometimes as we age, our functional and physical decline can happen, and it can cause impairments. And those are definite challenges that can have an impact on our mental health. Remember how I said our physical health and our mental health go hand in hand? We can't separate them. You live with chronic pain, that's going to affect your mental health. You don't sleep well, you have insomnia or other sleeping issues, it's going to affect your mental health. All of these things have an impact, okay? And the other thing that we saw with the pandemic was that stress and anxiety did increase. We saw this across our country. We did a lot of surveys around this to see where people were at, and we know that it increased. And across the board, a lot of people talk about youth during the pandemic and how they had such a difficult time. But to be honest, these numbers rose no matter what the age category was. And stress and anxiety can be overwhelming. And what's hard too is if we've never been taught how to talk about it or how to have those conversations, it can make it even more difficult. And we know that when we have chronic disease and we add a level of stress, it can make some other illnesses worse. Again, that connection between mental and physical health. So what actually is stress? Stress is fascinating to me. And if anybody knows how to make it go away, please contact me and we will make a lot of money. I don't know how to take it away from you, but I do know how to recognize it and some things that we can do to look at how to manage it for ourselves. Stress is actually the body's reaction to a change, and it can be physical, mental, or emotional, or even all three. And sometimes it may start as one, that pain in the back of your neck, your head, and then you're exhausted, and then you're irritable. So see how it affects all three? What's interesting though, stress can come from any situation. And what stresses me out definitely might not stress somebody else out, or vice versa. I have no problem talking to people. I did a presentation at a conference yesterday in front of hundreds of people. I'm fine with that. But are there other things that stress me out? Oh, is there? So it's important to recognize that our stress is our stress, and that it may not be the same as the person we live with, the person who helps us on a regular basis, the person who we consider family. And stress doesn't always look stressful. Sometimes it's exciting, right? What's interesting though is our body doesn't know the difference between something that scares us, something that excites us, something that makes us nervous. Guess what does? This thing. It's your brain. Your brain is the thing that makes that decision if that's exciting or stressful, if that's wondrous or terrifying. Your brain does that. Think, There's people in this world who love watching scary movies. There's people who don't. There's people who love roller coasters. There's people who don't. People who like heights and the thrill of being in a plane and up high. There's people who don't. The brain is the thing that making that decision. But what we do know is that however stress is impacting you, it has an impact on our mental health. And we know that in older adults, we're seeing some very different stressors come into play, especially this isolation piece. And not knowing, oh my goodness, the fear of not knowing when something will end, when another change will happen. Do we go back into lockdown? What restrictions am I living under? This fear, this constant fear that we've been living in for 2 years is very hard on our body and our brains. We worry about our health. We worry about our health of our loved ones. We're seeing an increase in the use of drugs and alcohol, coping mechanisms, boredom. We've seen severe changes in people's sleep and eating habits, not being able to fall asleep, not staying asleep. We're sleeping too much. And all of these are stressors that were kind of compounded by this pandemic. And that's still that fear of the unknown. It's amazing to me when we don't have knowledge and information, how that fear grows, percolates, and it grows quickly. And so the more information we can have, the better we can do, and the better we can look at our situation ourselves and kind of gather that information, the better we can be. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But there's one other thing that I want you to know that we collectively experienced: grief. Now, often we associate grief as the loss of a loved one, and it is, or the loss of a pet. But collectively, we have lost so much over the last 2 years. Whatever normal is. I don't think anybody knows what that means anymore. Finances, people, experiences, connection. And now we hear about this new phase that we're going into. The pandemic's over. No, it's not. We're entering into a new phase, this new normal, whatever it looks like. We're seeing things like re-entry anxiety or post-COVID stress disorder, or people who are watching some portions of our population move on and we're not, for whatever reason. Maybe it's the way we're in a long-term care and those restrictions haven't been lifted. Maybe we work in healthcare, those restrictions haven't been lifted. It's important to recognize that we are not all in the same boat. We never have been, we never will be. We were all in this pandemic ocean together, yes, but our boats are all different sizes, capabilities, and they change. Sometimes we might be on a yacht. Woo, we're sailing along. We got this. It's all good. We got lots of supports, lots of people around us, lots of things we need to help us. Some days we might just be holding onto a pool floaty and not doing very well at all, not managing very well. Some days maybe that wave is just so big it's taking our yacht down. So saying we're all in the same boat is one of those really difficult things, because we're not. We need to recognize that even if we're in similar situations, we experience things very differently. I can tell you the 5 people in my house, we all experience this very differently. We experience different losses. We experience different times of overwhelming. And the same thing with being in a long-term care, whether you're working in it or living in it. There's things that you're experiencing that the rest of the world is not and haven't and won't. And so we need to acknowledge that. We need to be mindful of that, of everybody's experiences. So how do you tell when stress has become too much? So there's 4 categories here. Now, I don't want you to look at this and go, whoo, I got them all. You might do that. What I'm looking for is for you to focus on those things that you recognize in yourself, maybe on a regular basis when things become too much. So cognitively, where are you at? Are you having any memory problems? Are you having an inability to concentrate? When I become stressed out, this is the first thing to go. I struggle with this. I feel like I have 1,000 tasks to do and I'm not doing any very well. And guess what that does? It increases my agitation and makes me very irritable. So my cognitive affects my emotions. And it can affect me physically and behaviorally as well. Headaches, stomach pain, lack of energy, loss of sex drive, increase in just overall pain. And then behaviors we're seeing, from that trouble sleeping and eating that I was talking about to engaging in risky behavior. What's risky behavior? That could be anything. It could be using substances we never did before. It could be driving recklessly. It could be not taking medication that we need. There can be a lot of things that might show up for you when you're overloaded with stress. But I don't want to just focus on those negative things. I want to focus on some of those things that we can do to cope. Okay? I get this question all the time about the news. What do we do? How do we distance ourselves? Well, there's this thing out there that it's called FOMO. It's called fear of missing out. And so we become glued to the news in whatever way, shape, or form. We feel like if I don't watch this, I'm not going to know what's happening. But watching news of world wars, pandemics, all of these things can be incredibly upsetting and stressful. And so it's okay to take breaks from that. It's okay to say, no, I didn't look at anything today. It wasn't good for me today. We need to take care of our bodies because our bodies and our brains go together. So the more we can do to feel healthy physically, the better it is. Now, that's going to look different for everybody because maybe we have food allergies or maybe we have mobility limitations. So what it looks like for you may be very different from the person across from you or the person in the same room as you or the person down the hall or the person you work with. So finding those things that help you keep moving in whatever way that looks like. Taking time to de-stress and unwind, trying activities that help you do that. So when we talk about this, we need to think about those things that don't add to our day, that are just part of our day ongoing, that help us to do that. Whether it's reading a book, doing a puzzle, spending time with people, or just being outside, okay? We also know one thing that helps us is connecting with others. Now, I will say thank goodness for things like Zoom and FaceTime that occurred during this pandemic that we never experienced before. It kept us connected, not in the same way for sure, but at least connected. And for some people, it was much easier than others. For some people, that loss of connection was overwhelming, devastating. So finding ways in which to do that, connecting with other people, talking with people who you trust about anything that you're concerned with around your mental health. And that might include your healthcare provider. And here's a conversation that can be really difficult to have if you've never, ever talked about this before. So we often think that people will ridicule us. They won't believe us. And that we often, especially as we age, they focus on the physical. Oh, you feel this way because. Sometimes I feel this way because my brain isn't working right. And I need some help with that. Okay. So coping strategies can look very different depending on where you live, your circumstance. And making those connections for some is way easier than others, but it's an important piece to add. So I'd like you to pop into the chat for me. What are some of the things that helped you during the pandemic? I like to hear from people the things that they did for fun or that they found were helpful or great. If you can just take a moment and pop that into the chat for me, I'd really appreciate it. What are some of the things that are activities that helped you throughout the pandemic? Ooh, indoor plants. Awesome. Nature, right? I don't think we ever wanted to be outside more than we did during this pandemic, right? Music, yes. Absolutely. That's awesome. Nice. Listening and discovering Spotify. Very cool. Knitting. Yeah, I've known a lot of people who took up knitting and crocheting. Wonderful. See how different we are? It's funny because pre-pandemic, reading was one of my favorite things to do. Absolute favorite. I have a very large bookshelf in front of me that I'm looking at. As soon as this pandemic hit, I had a hard time reading, focusing on something else. So I love the fact that you guys are all sharing the different things that helped you. That's amazing. Yes, TV series, definitely. Ooh, trying different cuisine. That's a great idea. Podcasts. Yes, I know a lot of people who found podcasts during this. Praying. Thank you, David. That's awesome. So thank you all for sharing. I think it's important. One of the things that kind of happened during this pandemic is our focus on the negative. You know, the news was negative. Every time we turned it on, there was another restriction or another problem, or cases were rising, or another variant. We focused on the negative. We also did a bit of shaming in a way. And what we would do is when somebody would tell us if they did something fun, we'd be like, how? How did you have fun last weekend? How did you do that? But it's okay to have fun, even in the middle of a pandemic. It's okay to find those things that are going to work for you and celebrate them. And you share them with others so that others can think, yeah, maybe I'll give that a try. So thank you all so much for doing that with me today. I really appreciate that. Oh, board games. Awesome. So this is what we call our stress tracking sheet. It looks complicated, but it's really not. And what it does is it helps to identify where your stress is coming from, what we can do about it, and what level of control do we have over it. So what I'd like you to do is think about, where does your stress come from? Now, some of us will say, oh, my stress is from work. Okay, but what does that mean? Is it a person or people at work? Is it the workload? Is it where you work? Like physical location, it's hard to get to, you got to drive there, or because you're working from home. Sometimes we say, oh, everything's stressing me out, my family. Okay, let's be specific. Who in your family is involved in your stress? Is it your partner? Is it your siblings? Is it a neighbor or a friend? And then we want to look at this next column. How often is this happening? Is this from the moment I wake up? Am I thinking about this all day long? Or is it happening often during the day, but I do get breaks from it? Or is it just sometimes? And then, take a look at this column. High control, some control, or no control. So what do we have control over in our lives? What don't we? You know, we might say, oh, the government is stressing me out. Yep, they might be. Do we have control over that right now? No, but in June we have some control. We get to vote. But right now we don't. And then that last column is looking at those things that we are already doing to cope. Are we using humor? Are we just not talking about it? Are we ignoring it and withdrawing from it? Are we getting help with it? Are we using anger or more indecision? What this helps us do is look at our stress level, where it's coming from, and the things we can actually do something about. And thinking about how important that is for each of us. And it helps us to kind of break it down and prioritize. So it's not, when we do that, it becomes not everything in our life is stressful, but some things are. And now I know what those are. And now I can pinpoint those things. And I can think about what can I do about it. Okay. So that leads me to this topic of resilience. I love talking about this. Why? Because I really don't think it means what you think it means. A lot of people think resilience, people either have it or they don't. Not true. Resilience is not something you're born with. Resilience is a learned behavior, and we can learn it at any age. And man, did we have to learn resilience through this last 2 years. The other thing that we think about is tragedy has to happen in order to develop resilience. Not at all. There's some pretty resilient people out there that I know who worked really hard on developing those skills. I kind of like thinking of it like this. I want you to imagine you went into your kitchen. You wanted to make something for dinner. Okay. So you go and turn the light on, but it doesn't turn on. And you're like, oh, that's weird. So you go and replace the light bulb. It's got to be the light bulb. So you replace that, but it's not the light bulb. You're like, oh, okay, now what? All right, maybe it's the breaker. I'll go change the breaker. Awesome. Nope, that's not it. All right, I give up. I'm just never gonna, I'm gonna be in the dark in the kitchen, in my kitchen for the rest of my life. We don't. We get help. We learn. We call for help. Resilience isn't going it alone either. Resilience is not sucking it up and pushing through. Resilience is learning, okay, what's next? How do I get there? That's what resilience is. It's not easy. But the other thing is, it's not something you have to do alone. And man, were we ever taught that? Well, they're resilient. They've got this. They don't need my help. No, resilience isn't being by yourself. Resilience is knowing when you need help and asking for it. And saying, I could use some help with this. Are we going to say that somebody who's trying to, move a giant rock isn't resilience because they had to ask somebody to help them? Not at all. Smart. So we can learn it at any age. So how do we do that? Okay. How do we build resiliency? Not as easy as you think, but we know connecting with people who make our lives better. And we all have toxic kind of experiences in our life, people in our life, but it's focusing on the ones that bring us joy, ones that make us smile, ones that make us laugh. Having connections, people we can lean on, is part of building resiliency. Here's a tough one. Avoid seeing crises as insurmountable problems. When a crisis happens, man, do we ever look for the negative first? We're like, oh, this is so bad. This is so awful. When stressful things happen, when people happen, when things happen in our lives, what we need to start to do is look at what's strong in a situation first, rather than what's wrong. Human nature, we look at what's wrong first, and then we find all the reasons why it won't work. When we can look at a situation and see if there's anything strong in that situation, it gives us the ability to fix those things that are wrong and move forward. We have to accept that change is a part of living, and I think anything the pandemic has taught us is definitely that. But it doesn't mean that you can't have goals. And what I think, though, we need to do is set goals that are reasonable. But as human beings, guess what we do? We set these really lofty goals, and then we're like really defeated when we don't meet them. Well, we did that to ourselves. Instead, set a goal that you can reach it, set another one. Because you know what that does? It increases your confidence, your self-esteem. It builds you up. And there's nothing wrong with that. There is nothing wrong with reaching a realistic goal and setting another one, or being happy with where you are. It's also important that we take action on things, decisive action, make a decision and move forward, what that's going to look like. Often when we ruminate or stay in a space and really reflect on difficulties, that's when things become even more difficult. So it's about looking too at ourselves and what in ourselves is resilient. What can we build upon? Like I said, it's a building block. The next time you're having a conversation with yourself and you're beating yourself up inside, I want you to think about if you were having this conversation with your best friend and your best friend had come to you with the same concerns that are roaming around in your head, would you talk to them the way you're talking to yourself? And if you did, would you be friends with them? Because we're not kind to ourselves. We know how to be kind to others, but we have a lot of difficulty nurturing a positive view of ourselves and understanding that we do have skills and we do have instincts and we can build upon things. So remember that. Remember to give yourself a bit of grace as we think about how to help ourselves. It's also important that we keep things in perspective and maintain that hopeful outlook. And I know some days that's way easier than others. But I want you to think about your brain like this. Your brain is malleable. We can change it. We can make it do new things all the time. It's awesome that way. So imagine that you want to buy a new car. You're excited. You've never had this type of car. You want it so bad. Maybe you're going to splurge and buy a Mercedes, right? It's what you've always dreamed of. So what are you going to see everywhere you go? You're going to see a Mercedes, right? You're going to all of a sudden notice that your neighbor has one. Ooh, I didn't know Susan at work had a Mercedes. Oh, I like that color, Mercedes. That's what our brain does. When something becomes important, or that's where our focus is, that's where our brain goes. So when we can look at the positive side of things, or the strong, not even the positive, but the strong side of things, our brain tends to look for that first moving forward instead of always the negative. And it's a little bit like you get the energy you give off. Your brain kind of gets stuck and comfortable, and it doesn't care whether it's good, happy, or sad, but you do. So focusing on those things that are really positive in a situation rather than negative first. Take care of yourself. Pay attention to your own needs and feelings and know that they matter today and every day. They do. They matter as much as the person sitting next to you. And we need to look after them just like we would do our physical body. So a couple of those things. Focus on what's strong rather than what's wrong. And this one, know the difference between what you can change and what you don't have an effect on. I struggle with this one because I want to affect change everywhere I go. Some days I can't. Some days I'm not very good at it. The other thing that's important to remember is we can't change other people's responses to events, but we can change our own. Sometimes that's taking a breather before we respond. Deep breath. A minute or two or half an hour before we send an email or text message or pick up the phone. Just giving ourselves that grace and space. Now, this is my favorite slide because I think this is the opposite of what we were all taught. Rest is not something to be earned. Rest is a place where we need to start. Think about it. When you've had a restful time, you've had a great sleep, you woke up rested, or even just after, taking some time for yourself, how good does that make you feel? But what we were taught is our chores have to be done first, or I have to get all these tasks done before I can even think about resting. I don't deserve it yet. I'm not done. Well, what if we switch that? What if it was the place to which we started from? Think about how productive we could possibly be if that's where we began, and if we rested when we needed it. Rest is not something we are only allowed once and then it's gone. Okay? Rest is a place where we begin. I want to tell you about a couple of resources and then we can open it up to questions. There's a resource out there called Bounce Back, and we found a huge uptake in this over the pandemic. It was actually created about 2 years pre-pandemic. And what it is it's a supportive program that's done over the phone. It is free. It's available to anybody over the age of 15, and there is no wait list. And the great part is it's also available in 12 different languages. You work with a coach, a mental health coach, over the phone. And you get to work through 20 modules that you can pick and choose the modules that interest you. You don't have to do all 20. There's no cost to this. You can self-refer. You don't need your doctor's referral. And you work through the things that are important to you. Another free resource is Mind Beacon. Mind Beacon is what we call free digital therapy. So what that means is you're talking to a registered therapist, but you're doing it via email or text messaging. But you're talking to a therapist who designs a program for you. Both Bounce Back and Mind Beacon are skill building. So they teach you how to learn to work with your own emotions, how to support them, how to recognize them, how to learn more about them. Okay. And if you're ever needing of other resources, you can check out literally any CMHA, not just ours in Hamilton. There's lots of services out there. And I also want to put Canada's Suicide Prevention Service up. Canada's Suicide Prevention Service is available 24 hours a day by phone, or you can text anytime from 4 p.m. to midnight. All right. I am going to stop sharing, and I'm going to see if you guys have some questions. I see a couple popping in here. Oh, that's a good one. Thank you for that question. So the question came in, how do you deal with situations that have barriers that you can't change? Yeah, because sometimes that happens, right? We couldn't change the fact that there were restrictions and we couldn't go out. That wasn't a thing we could change. So what around that, though, was something we could control? Maybe it was setting up an opportunity to connect via Zoom or FaceTime with somebody once a week. That was something I could control. I couldn't control that certain thing, but I could control how I connected with people. Another thing, when a restriction comes down, it interfered with so many people's milestones, plans, events that were important to them. That was not something we could control. But what could we control? We could control how we responded to that. So did we change the plan? Did we make the plan simpler? Did we put the plan on hold? All of those things were things that we could control. It's really hard when there is something that we want and we need so badly. And sometimes it's about just recognizing that this is something I can't change and grieving that. It's okay to grieve that you've lost that opportunity or that moment and recognize that. It's a difficult one to do, but sometimes those are things we have to do as well. So any other questions that you have for me? I really like questions, so I don't consider anything a stupid one either, because sometimes we ask a question and other people are experiencing it as well.
Hi, Jill. Thank you so much for the questions to everyone who has submitted. There is one in the question group now, but before we get to that one, there were some questions that came in during the registration period.
Okay.
And a lot of them focused around isolation and how to support your mental health when you're in isolation and when you can't make those connections.
Right. And to be honest, I think that was one of the most common questions we got over the last 2 years. And I think the tough part is it's such an individual answer, because we all have things that interest us and we all have points in time where we struggle more than, say, somebody else. For being stuck in isolation, I talked to a number of people who created vision boards, places they wanted to go or things they wanted to do when the pandemic was over. So they created the best virtual vacation they possibly could. And for them, that was enough. For me, I couldn't even look at a vacation because I felt like it's what I lost, what I wasn't going to get out. I didn't know if I was going to get that back. So what did that look like? So for other people, it's about finding those things that are going to help you. And I found that connecting with people who are in similar situations as me was very helpful. I have 3 adult children. I'll give you this as an example. And I really struggled with having 5 adults in my home every day, all day, for a very long time. I had friends who had little children. they had different circumstances going on in their world. And it was really hard for us to connect because our situations weren't similar. Our stressors weren't the similar. So it was connecting with people who were going through something I was, and unloading and talking about it and not being afraid to say, I am struggling right now. It took me a long time to admit that partway through the pandemic, because everybody sees us and people you work with and each other as you're the caregivers, you're the support people in the family, you're the strong one in the family. I'm sure you've probably all heard that. You can't be struggling, but we can. And so it was recognizing that when I was, what could that look like? And what did that mean? And it is going to be so different for everybody. And I saw too in the chat that recognizing death and dying is a huge piece of this. And I think one of the things we've learned, especially around grief, is there's definitely no timeline. There's no specific way to say, it's been 3 months since this person passed, I should feel better. You might not. Somebody else might seem like they're fine 2 weeks later. They're processing it differently. Everybody does. You've probably heard all about those stages of grief, right? What people go through. But the interesting part I always say about stages of grief is it's not linear. It's not like you go through it straight and then you come out the other side. Sometimes you're like halfway here and then nope, I'm back here again. That's being human. Loss is horrible. Losing people, and especially during a pandemic where we didn't have the opportunity to say goodbye or for any closure or what that looked like. Those things are really challenging. And I always say to people, there is no right or wrong time to reach out and get help for how you are feeling. Sometimes all we need to do is talk about it. We need that listening ear. I have a very big family. I have lots of sisters. I have a brother, but I have one sister who I can call. She actually used to be the ED of a long-term care home. And I do what we call with each other verbal diarrhea. So I talk to her, I tell her everything that's going on in my life. Bleh. She doesn't try and fix it. She just listens. And then she says, I'll talk to you tomorrow. And I do the same for her. But it took us a while to get there because we didn't like seeing the other one in pain and we wanted to fix it. We wanted to help that person. But helping sometimes just means opening these and shutting this.
Jill, that's a nice segue into another common theme that came through in the questions upon registration, and that was how to be a peer support. So you've already mentioned how it's helpful to talk to others who are going through the same experience as you. And for the people living in long-term care, a lot of our resident leaders have asked how they could be a better peer support.
So the first thing that I can tell you when you're trying to support somebody, and it doesn't matter whether it is in a long-term care or somewhere else, to be a good peer support is to stop trying to fix it for the person. But that's human nature. We don't like people being upset. We don't like people being sad or in pain in any way, shape, or form. So we want to fix it, but realizing that we can't. But what we can do is that listening piece. Listening allows people to feel heard. It allows them to unleash. It allows them to get things out that are being very overwhelming. And listening, one of the great questions I heard asked over this is, do you want me to just listen, or do you want me to help you listen and problem solve? And I think that takes the onus off of what we're supposed to do when we're trying to help somebody. And if somebody does want us to problem solve, one of the questions I always throw back is, what do you think would help you right now? What could I do that might be helpful just in this moment? That's the other thing. We tend to focus on, oh, I can't do this. I need to feel better, 3 weeks from now, or I need to make this keep going for the next 3 months. What we need to focus on sometimes is what's happening in this next 10 minutes and how do I get through that? And what is that going to take? Is it going to take a crying session? Crying is incredibly therapeutic for some people. Am I going to, do I need to talk to somebody? Do I need to be on my own? What does that look like? We also think because we have been in a similar situation as somebody, we know what works. No, we know what works for ourselves. We don't necessarily know what works for somebody else. What works for my husband is very different than what works for me. What works for all three of my kids, very different than each other. And that's okay. And I think we actually take offense sometimes when we offer up a whole bunch of ideas to people and they don't take them. We're like, but you asked for my help. Yeah, and help can just be listening. But it's on the caregiver's part that we struggle with that, not on the person who needs to vent. So that's a great question.
Thank you so much, Jill. I can't believe that our hour together is almost up. We really appreciate your gentle, authentic, and candid way of addressing this heavy topic. It's so appreciated. Thank you for the beautiful reminder to give ourselves grace, and for the suggestion to speak to yourself as if you're speaking to your best friend. Thank you to all who submitted questions. I hope you found the discussion as informative and engaging as I did. And I invite you to complete the post-webinar evaluation to help us identify future learning needs and opportunities. This recording will be available on the OARC website, so you can share with your peers and team members who may have missed it, or refer back to it if you found anything particularly interesting to you or helpful. This concludes our webinar for today. On behalf of the team at OARC, I wish you all a good day. Stay safe and stay well.
Thank you, everybody, and happy Mental Health Week.
Thank you, Jill.